Muscle memory is they've practiced and practiced and practiced so many times, breaking your gun down in the dark, putting it back together, swimming in the dark, putting all your gear together, and it's completely dark. So you know the muscle movements of how to do certain things in such a way that you don't even really have to almost think about it anymore. You've trained your body, you've trained your mind, you've trained your coordinated systems here, pre-command, projection, and segmental, to do these things without a lot of basic thought about it. And if you make a mistake, because you're going to get feedback, something's going to go wrong. Now, we've talked about this. Notice at the very bottom there's a little line that goes from sensory input back to motor input, and that's a very basic reflex activity. Reflexes are what we're going to talk about next. This is rapid, predictable motor response to a stimuli. Okay, folks, everybody can think about it. The last time you got a physical and the doctor came up and had this funny-looking little hammer and said, please cross your legs, and tapped you on the patella tendon, and it caused your leg to move up. Blip. Well, that was a reflex. You didn't even have to think about it. Very predictable. Very spontaneous, it just happens. Okay. Now think about it this way. You step on a tack or something else like that, and you can feel the puncture. You get the sensory input coming up. You have the receptor picking up the pain or the puncture or the pressure, whatever you want to define. The receptor passes the information on to a sensory neuron. Now it's going to be fast, so it's got to be myelinated. Okay. Brings it into the spinal cord. The spinal cord, on the dorsal root end, passes it on to an interneuron. Now, this is going to be an interneuron that's going to be directly connected to a motor neuron. That's going to be your output. The integration center is the interneuron. And what's going to happen is the motor neuron is going to pass down the information to cause the effector, in this case a muscle, to contract. Okay? That's pretty simplistic. Wait till we get into more of this. But keep in mind a couple of things. The components of a reflex arc are receptor, sensory neuron, integration center. Now look, you see where that interneuron is? That would be called a monosynaptic reflex. There's only, it might be considered more polysynaptic. Two neurons. And in some cases, if it's really two neurons, there isn't an interneuron in between. It's sensory neuron connected to a motor neuron, and that's it. Polysynaptic may be one or more interneurons present. The motor neuron definitely has to play a role, and that's going to leave out the ventral horn, and it's going to innervate your target. Again, this is going to be a high-speed reaction, going to probably involve heavy myelination. For example, when they tap your knee, what they're really testing is also not merely just your reflex, but the neural system and its integrity. If someone doesn't respond to that patella tap, that might be an indication of all sorts of different neural pathologies, including multiple sclerosis. Now, the somatic reflex activates skeletal muscles. Autonomic, visceral reflex, you're going to have visceral effectors, either heart, gland, or smooth muscle. That, a lot of cases, we're going to talk about a little bit more with the autonomic nervous system too. Also, you need to review briefly the muscle spindle. Remember that there's a sensor inside the muscle itself, and it has several different nerve fibers. You have the gamma efferent motor fiber to the muscle spindle. That's going to basically tell that muscle spindle to contract. Okay, no problem. You're going to have the secondary sensory endings. Those are type 2 fibers. And you're going to have the primary sensory endings, type 1A fiber. What are we doing here? The sensory information will tell you how the muscle spindle will contract, with what extent it will contract, etc. And this also has several interfusal muscle fibers. You'll have the extrafusal muscle fibers, meaning outside of this spindle. And you have the entire muscle spindle there. And it's in a connective tissue capsule. Basically, this is like saying you've got a sensor inside of every one of those muscles, large muscles particularly, that gives you this proprioception, the sense of, hey, is this muscle contracting or not? And is it sufficient? Is it intense? Is it painful? Is it able to contract just a little bit or a lot? And by the way, we have other sensory information coming from another set of proprioceptor sensory fibers. These are the Golgi tendon organ. In other words, the tendon is going to be, after the muscle contracts, the next tissue that gets influenced, and that's going to have that sense of the pull from the muscle, because the tendon is connected to from muscle to usually bone, right? So when the muscle contracts, the tendon will follow in a contraction or some force on it, and the Golgi tendon organ will report that also. It's always nice to have a lot of information for what the function of the body is. And by the way, inside of this this muscle spindle, really, you can make several pieces of information. Remember I talked about how action potentials can't be super big or super small. You have one size fits all, right? But I said, depending on the period of time, you can have upwards in 1 second to 500 APs per second. So that means you can code that information. You can have a differentiation of the reports coming in from an unstretched muscle, a stretched muscle, or if something's happening where you're getting compression of the muscle instead of it having the extension. Or you could have coactivation of both extrafusal and intrafusal muscle fibers contracting. And all of this will tell you the status of the muscles. Are you overextending them, underextending them, etc.? And yes, without a signal, that's also a means of telling you that there's something going on. Now, why are we building this all up? Because a simple reflex, like a patella reflex or something else like that, is not built on just a couple of simple nerves and that's it. When you start studying this, you find that you have a sensory neuron and its attachment is not by some little device. It's actually at a muscle spindle. And there's a muscle spindle in the agonistic muscle and the antagonistic muscle. In other words, one muscle that would cause, let's say, flexion, and the opposite one would cause extension. You have to have all of that information. And you have to inhibit one if the other is going to be contracted. That's the next step we're going to be moving on into. Okay? So, keeping in mind this, and I want to make sure I've covered all of this, we've just finished the tone of muscle as reported, resistance to active or passive stretch at rest, and the info is provided by the spindles. Now we're going to start getting into the stretch reflexes. And by the way, there is a focus section in your chapter that talks about the stretch reflex. Let's go over the patellar knee-jerk reflex as an example of a stretch reflex. The stretching of the muscle activates the muscle spindle. The action activates two neural pathways in the spinal cord. Two-neuron process contracts the quadriceps. A three-neuron process with an interneuron present relaxes or inhibits the hamstring muscle. The result is an extension of the knee and the foot. If you take a look there, what we do is we have the patella ligament. We stretch that with the whacking of the small hammer. That causes the quadriceps to be extended, to be stretched a bit. And this is passed on, and the response is, of course, twofold. You're going to have information passed on, and it's going to be in the spinal cord that there's going to be several pathways. The first pathway is going to activate the contraction of the quadriceps, which will cause the leg to move up. But Remember that leg movement is also controlled by the hamstrings, the flexors. You're going to extend the leg. The quadriceps are going to contract. But you have to make sure that the hamstrings do not interfere in this, because they would be the opposite, the flexor. So you're going to inhibit their pathways. And if you notice the little green association neuron or accessory neuron, that interneuron there is going to inhibit the hamstrings. With that inhibition, the quadriceps can effectively respond. Now, if it's getting complicated, think about this. You wrap it with the knee, the hammer. That's telling you a lot of information there. You're getting sensory response, check. You're getting proper, basically you're getting a proper excitatory synaptic feedback to the quadriceps, check. And you're getting also the proper inhibitory response to the hamstrings, the flexors. Check. With all of that, you get the extension of the knee and the foot, and you move on to the next diagnostic piece of information. And you can see this a little bit more extensively here, the quadriceps, the extensors, the hamstrings, the flexors, and you wondered why we had to learn those terms. Well, there you are. And you see this as really being multisynaptic and multineuron, monosynaptic, or polysynaptic, because you've got several interneurons playing a role here, okay? Now, all of that happens because if you notice there, the Golgi tendon organs are being activated when you whack with the hammer. And that's what is really causing this pathway to start this cascade of the quadriceps being stimulated to contract, the hamstrings being inhibited from contraction. Okay? And what we're going to do is go over two other reflexes. They're actually on the same chart here, 13.19. One is the flexor withdrawal reflex, and the other is the crossed extensor reflex. Now, to help you, you probably had situations where somebody tried to grab someone or something, and you see them pull their hand back. You know, of course, the other analogy is somebody says, well, what happens when you have a child that tries to put their hand on the stove? Ouch, they pull it back. This is usually a stimulus that is going to be painful and causes the withdrawal of the threatened body part from the stimulus. And you can see that as it occurs. You have the flexing. What you first have to have is a noxious, meaning painful, stimulus. And it's going to cause the flexor reflex on the same side. Okay? You're going to withdraw that limb. Now, in doing so, you have to have, basically, a polysynaptic pathway. And interestingly enough, you have 1, 2, 3, and you have to have the efferent fibers where the extensor muscle is going to be inhibited. The flexor is going to be stimulated. The arm will flex away from the painful stimuli. But here's the next part. Oh, by the way, this flexor or withdrawal reflex can be overridden by descending signals from the brain, but it just depends on the maturity of the individual, the age of the individual. The flexor will override spinal pathways and prevent other reflexes from using them at the same time. And also the thing is, it would be dependent on the actual health and integrity of the neural system. In other words, if there's no damage to the dorsal horn or the ventral horn, you might be sitting there going, well, what do you mean by that? What are some of the diseases we studied? Diseases like polio, etc., that could cause